In this video, brought to you by the glorious Out of Doors, I'm going to show you my favorite way to prime terrain. Just an FYI, the audio is going to be potentially a little janky because we're outside and there's birds and trucks and motorcycles and a lot of lawnmowers. So just keep that in mind. Sorry about that. So the thing is that when it starts to get a little bit warmer out, I find myself out deciding it is now time for me to get a bunch of terrain primed and ready to go for the year. I also see this sometimes when it's fall and you get a couple of days that are real nice and warm and kind of weird, and then you rush out, at least if you're me, and again, you prime a bunch of terrain so you've got stuff to paint over the winter. Now, you may ask yourself, well, but Uncle Adam, you've got an airbrush. You talk about airbrushes all the time and about how great they are and all that kind of stuff. Why don't you just prime your terrain with your airbrush? And that's a very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. But I really honestly believe that rattlecan and specific types of rattlecan can make it so that your terrain's paint job will last a lot longer than normally with like some airbrush primer. Now, this is not an ad. I'm not shilling for Rust-Oleum or Krylon or anything like that. It's just that the camouflage line of paints that they make, both companies now, are really, really good at getting attached to plastic. Like this one says, also bonds to plastic right there on the can. And there's fusion technology, which is a probably trademarked thing that the Krylon stuff has in their camouflage paints. And what that stuff does is it means it sticks really, really, really well to the terrain. And it's important to have your paint and your primer, by just being underneath the paint. It's really important to have that primer stick as well as possible to the terrain. The reasoning is because your terrain gets beat up and kicked around, hopefully not actually, but more metaphysically, much more than your models do. You're generally a lot more, a little bit more easy-handed with your models when you're transporting them and moving them around and stuff like that. But terrain kind of gets shifted around a good amount. Not only does terrain have models set upon it and moved along it and sometimes scratched along the surface of, sometimes terrain sits on top of other terrain. And in those situations, I'm always concerned about paint adhesion, really primer adhesion in that situation. If I've got a good layer of primer that's going to stick to the plastic, I know the paint's going to stick to the primer in most situations, and so I'm pretty happy about that. I have primed some pieces of terrain with airbrush, and I'll be honest, it's sometimes along the edges you do get some wear and tear, and that's kind of a bummer. But I can't think of a time where I've used any kind of rattlecan, again, specifically either the Rust-Oleum camouflage or the Krylon camouflage. I can't think of a time where I've ever had that stuff flake off of plastic terrain. Resin is maybe a little bit different, and that's frequently like resin terrain. If you don't wash it properly, it can be a real bummer. But with this stuff, or the Krylon or anything like that, that's designed and says it sticks to plastic, it's a really good idea. Now, the first step in pretty much any kind of situation in which you use rattlecan is that you need to rattle the can. And that's a thing that a lot of people don't do properly. You really need to shake for a long time. I've been shaking this can off camera for some time, at least a good couple of minutes, just a good straight couple of minutes. Let your mind wander, think about other things, whatever. And then, just like it is in many things within our hobby, thin coats are best. So what I'm going to do here is, and I'm using black in this situation because this piece of terrain from Warcry is going to be gray, mostly. I'm going to paint it so it's mostly stone. There are some wood bits on there, which I'll paint separately with a brush. Maybe I'll use an airbrush. It just depends on how I can do it. And I'll probably do some shading and stuff along the bottom that gives it kind of a mossy, sort of greenish at the bottom. But the base color is going to be gray stone, and the best color, in my opinion, underneath that gray color is black. Now, you could say, well, why don't you just prime it gray? And that's a situation you could get yourself into, but then you end up having to put a lot of wash on there to get into all the crevices. If you prime black first, and then use an airbrush or potentially a rattlecan or a big honkin' makeup brush with gray dry brush on it, you can then go through and do the gray of the rocks and the stone and all that stuff, but then all the crevices will stay real dark if you use this stuff properly. It's getting windy. this is the plan. Light coats. And when you're doing this, what you're going to find is it's, you want to, and you also don't just hold down and just go to town. You want to kind of spray, press down, drag across, and let up. Sometimes, depending on how you do it, depending on the company that makes the can, or even sometimes the way the can is designed, I have run out of propellant before I've run out of paint, possibly from doing this. I'm not going to lie. It's happened, I think, twice. One was just recently, which is why it's kind of fresh in my mind. But the idea is that when you do that, you waste generally less paint and less propellant as opposed to just holding it down and cranking on it. It's just light coats. The other thing, too, is you have a tendency not to completely coat the model with paint when you hold it down. When you dust it lightly, you catch a lot of nice little angles, and you can kind of catch along. But again, you're keeping thin coats, and that's the most important part. Now, of course, it's also important to make sure you go all the way around the model. Sometimes you might turn the piece of cardboard. I'm not going to do that here because it's going to mess up my second shot. So I'm walking around and spraying it from every angle. And then the important thing is to let it set. Let it set for probably 10 minutes or so that it can get pretty dry, not totally dry, but pretty dry. And then, because I'm only spraying this kind of top-down-ish, it's going to be very important for me to take the model and to start to flip it on its side to spray the parts that, frankly, at this point, I have missed. So now I've let it set up. It's getting a nice little sun bath, and it's pretty much, it's not tacky anymore to the touch. That's kind of the important thing. But you can see the model here. And now when I pick it up and I turn it like this, you can see all these places underneath that didn't get any paint on them because I was spraying it kind of top down. That's kind of the way it works. So once you've let it set up enough that you can flip it onto a side, it is now important to try to catch it again and get up underneath these areas, because especially with black, if you are dusting it from above and then you look at the model later, it's going to have the shadow on the top and the lighter part, the light gray of the plastic, in the underside, which looks like an upside down shadow and it kind of looks weird. So also, if you want the paint to stick pretty well, you still want to be able to dust it and catch it underneath all these little overhangs and undercuts that are in the terrain that you may be working with. And again, light coats. Oops. And now once that I've got this angle kind of back again to being dry to the touch, I just take this model and I find another angle to flip it to find areas I haven't caught, like underneath all the kind of like shelfy kind of overhang. That's the area that generally you won't see, I'm not going to lie, but it's still important to get some primer on there. I may not even paint under there with my final gray colors and all that stuff, but just the dark color in this situation makes a great shadow. And once you've given that a couple of minutes to kind of dry in the air and the sun and whatnot, you can now take your model, flip it right back up onto its bottom, and you've got a primed piece that is basically ready with a couple, maybe like a day worth of sitting around not doing anything. It is now ready for the next step, which, like I said, might be airbrushing gray onto it. I might be dry brushing gray onto it. I might be regular brushing gray onto it. There's lots of different options for painting terrain, but a good base with a good spray can, something like this, can keep that paint on your model for as long as you own it in many situations, whereas a bad prime can sometimes not do that. It'll sometimes let go of the paint and then things will chip off. We've all been to the game store before, probably, if you've been to a game store to play, and seen some terrain that's been a little beat up. You don't want your stuff to look like that. So I always prime this stuff. Even though I live in Wisconsin and you can't control what's going on outside, I always rattle can prime my terrain, and I get this stuff ready to go, flip it over, catch it from other sides, which is also good if you're rattle can priming miniatures too. You don't just want to spray them from above. You want to flip them onto their back and spray at their tummy, and then flip them over onto their tummy and then spray at their back to get it up underneath all the areas you might have missed by spraying down. So anyway, I wanted to give you guys some thoughts and maybe try filming something outside and see how that goes. So now that we're getting through spring and we're starting to eventually head into summer, start working on some terrain, get it built, get outside and prime it.